Hello and welcome to the Think Liberty podcast. I'm your host, Vinny Marshall. This is episode 38, and we're bringing back some friends to talk about MMT. Before we get into that, I just wanted to take a minute to let you know that the Think Liberty podcast is a part of the Think Liberty Podcast Network. You can go ahead and find it on SoundCloud, Stitcher, iTunes, or anywhere else you go to listen to podcasts. I'm not going to call out all of our social media stuff. You've heard it before. You know where to find us. Let's just get right into it. So we've brought back our guest from our last episode. Dylan, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great. How you doing, Vinny?
I'm doing awesome. Thank you very much for joining us. It was a popular episode. A lot of people listened to it, so I'm excited to get back into the weeds here. And we've brought in a new guest, and this is Nima. Nima, how are you doing tonight? Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Vinny. How are you doing?
I am doing very well. Okay, so we left off having covered a lot of ground. So I guess let's just jump right back into kind of the thick of it. I do have some questions here for you guys. And I guess we'll just start right off with the question. Okay, so MMT, modern monetary policy.
Theory.
So, theory.
Not MMP.
My bad. My slip. Yeah, not MMP. I've had a day. Modern monetary theory. So when you look at this, obviously there's a difference between like monetary theory and like monetary policy and economic policy. So I was wondering if you guys can help me clarify on where MMT starts and stops in that regard, if that question makes sense.
It doesn't make sense to me. Does it make sense to you, Nima?
Well, I would say that MMT makes some recommendations about monetary policy. So in that regard, you could connect the two, I guess. If that
okay,
makes
so
sense.
then is MMT... Now, remember, I didn't just forget everything we talked about, Dylan. I am trying to frame this. I am trying to frame it a bit for people that still, might not totally get it.
Yeah. We can go over stuff again.
I really just want to kind of clarify what is MMT, right? If it's not an economic policy, if it's not a monetary policy, what is it?
So from what I understand, it's a sort of body of knowledge that has just developed over the past couple of decades because different people from mostly post-Keynesian economics schools came together and started talking and writing about economics. And their focus mostly being on how the monetary system actually works. And so maybe since that's a big tent, you can't necessarily easily pin down, say this or that is MMT. The term itself is actually almost kind of misleading because it's not really modern, right? It's like it acknowledges monetary theories that have been around for as long as we know civilization. But after the neoclassical revolution, etc., to reintroduce these concepts, I guess some people consider that modern, so it was labeled that.
That is kind of funny now that you mention it, because it's like the on the Tom Woods episode with Dylan, you use like the kingdom as an example, which I thought was a really good example. That really helped me understand the premise a little bit better. But that's not modern at all.
Right.
Not at all.
Nothing modern about it.
It should be called ancient monetary theory.
Right. Originating.
Or just monetary theory.
Right, as if there's ever been anything else. Yeah. Okay. So that's actually helpful. That's really good. So Nima, the last time we were on here, we talked a little bit about this Bitcoin article you wrote and the way that Bitcoin works and how MMT kind of ties into that. And I wanted to hear that from you a little bit, if you could kind of expand a little bit on what that article was about.
So MMT basically, first of all, helped me understand why the US dollar bill in my hand has value. It's because there's a government that demands that token in taxes and fees. And in Bitcoin, I found you can basically establish the exact same monetary flow to explain the value of Bitcoin. With the minor difference that there's no violent taxation, but a voluntary fee for blockchain access. So where in the fiat money economy, the money is created by the government spending it into circulation, and then it's destroyed by taxation. In the Bitcoin economy, a miner basically introduces Bitcoins into the non-miner sector by spending it, and it's taken out of the non-miner sector via the fees that the private sector pays to the miners. So there's that same kind of circle from start to finish, with the only difference being that there's no violent taxation. It's a voluntary fee for blockchain access.
Do you favor cryptocurrency for that reason?
Yes.
I mean, I would assume, right? You're able to take out the violence part.
Yeah.
I
think that's great. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So this is, you see as like an inherent part of the way that the money works, and that's how Bitcoin's able to work. And in that sense, you would agree that that's kind of an evolution of money.
It seems like it. Yeah. Yeah. It seems like it.
Okay.
Can I interject?
Please.
Well, me and Nima might disagree with this a little bit, but one of the things that I said before is I see Bitcoin as a prototype for a private currency, because one of the prime differences, along with the fact that, you know, there's no violence in the Bitcoin realm, is that there's not really a clear reason why anyone should value the blockchain at this point. Where there's a very clear reason why I value not being thrown in jail because I didn't pay my taxes. And you know, I made the corollary that, you know, if you look at a cryptocurrency like Steam, where you know, Steam tokens actually give you media presence on the Steam platform, where you can start to say, okay, I see the direct value of why I might want these Steam tokens. There isn't quite that specific value on the Bitcoin blockchain yet.
I think that people would argue, well, see, Bitcoin was created to be a digital currency. So the blockchain is valuable in that it's what makes it possible for Bitcoin to be, and whether or not anyone believes this is accurate, it varies on person to person, but decentralized. Right. And so there's the value in that, is its utility as a currency, as it was made to be.
But the logic becomes circular.
But I don't disagree with you that it may be a prototype. What's that?
The logic becomes circular. So we're valuing the blockchain. What, hold on a second. We want the blockchain because it's valuable, and shit. I had a circular argument in my mind that I can't think of it now. But here's my point, to say, okay, it's valuable because it's decentralized. That doesn't really tell me anything. Like I can't exchange it for decentralization. Right? With United States dollars, I could exchange it for, you know, temporary respite from government violence, or with Steam tokens, I could exchange it for media presence. I can't really exchange Bitcoin with the miners for anything other than access to the blockchain, which doesn't really get me anything.
Oh, I don't know if that's true.
What do you mean?
I don't know if that's...
Well, it depends on who you are. It gets you something if you need a time-stamping machine. And if, in particular, if you need the best, most secure, most decentralized, first ever time-stamping machine on the planet, then you totally see value in that.
Right.
You as a consumer, you know, you don't necessarily see it. But I think still the ultimate value proposition of Bitcoin all stems from the value of having access to the blockchain.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you even look at somewhere like China, right, where they have basically gone in a way to where is anti-crypto but pro-blockchain. Right, they've shut down all the trading, they've shut down all the stuff, but they just want the blockchain technology. Right, for them, there's nothing, there's no value in the crypto, there's value in the blockchain. So it's completely opposite.
Interesting, yeah. Private blockchains.
And to your argument about what do you pay the miners for? I mean, Bitcoin is valuable, right? You can give the miner a Bitcoin for anything. Right, like I could probably buy a car off of a miner in Bitcoin.
No, but I mean, then the miner's not acting as an issuer at that point. The miner's acting as just as another person.
Oh, you know, in that, okay,
Yeah, I'm talking about the relationship of the currency to the issuer of that currency.
Sure.
So the
Yeah,
relationship
it's
to
like
the
with
dollar to the United States government, or the relationship to Steam tokens to Steam it.
Yeah, Bitcoin just doesn't work like that, though.
I know, and that's why I think it's a prototype.
It could
Well,
be.
and I understand we disagree on it, but like I said in the last one, of all the cryptocurrencies I have, Steam is the only one that I realized I was holding for reasons other than pure speculation.
Oh, sure. Yeah, Steam has a really cool utility to it. That's without a doubt. I agree with that. It is able to.
I think I interrupted Nima.
I don't think so, but I don't think that there's much. There's going to be different competing currencies, and it doesn't necessarily have to be one is the prototype and the other is the real deal or whatever. Different individuals need different currencies for different reasons, and so there will be a competition. There will be different solutions for different people.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, so this is interesting to me. So you have, you do appreciate the private currency. So, as best I understand, with modern monetary theory, does there have to be a monopolist? Or is that just kind of saying, look, this is how it is with governments and this is how it goes?
There has to be an issuer.
Yeah, there has to be a. Does there have to be monopoly? A monopoly on what is the question? Monopoly on taxation? Well, I guess, yes. There has to be a monopoly on taxation. It's enough authority to impose a tax to begin with, and other than that, obviously, for the private banking system, when loans are made, that doesn't necessarily have to be monopoly. Monopoly can be decentralized, as it is in our economy. So part centralized, part decentralized, works. Or in some cases, you can have a completely centralized banking system. It's not fundamentally different from a decentralized one. It's just that in a decentralized one, you have individual banks competing for profits of the interest. Yeah.
Right. Okay. It's just in a lot of what I read, it's talked about. That's like a lot of times where the conversation starts is from the issuer or from the monopolist, as it were.
Well, and this may be where me and Nima differ from the other MMTers, where we say,
you guys are kind of
we say, how do we apply this to private currencies?
Right.
Yeah, most MMTers aren't really very curious about Bitcoin, from what I've seen, or any crypto, for that matter.
Right, and so this brings me up to another question. Is so this, as best I've seen, you and Nima are very rare, in that I've not even seen a lot of MMT supporters who weren't democratic socialists.
Yeah, it's also true.
Right. This is primarily where I'm seeing it. Right.
Warren Mosler, he's a libertarian. He's the founder of MMT basically, and he's a libertarian. So there's that.
He is. And that's, I've read a lot of his stuff. Now he leans a little bit differently than I do in some stuff, but to your point, he is. I just
don't we all lean a little differently?
No, we certainly do. I mean, just kind of in the sense of, he's for federal job expansion and stuff like that. And I really do have a legitimate concern about how libertarian you can be when you're for so much expansion of federal.
Well, he's for a federal job, transition job, not a job expansion.
Okay, so explain that a little bit, a transition job.
So in the monetary system, as MMT understands it, it always begins with the government imposing a tax, correct?
Yes.
And imposing a tax makes everyone who needs to pay the tax unemployed. So if you start this whole monetary economy where the government imposes a tax, from the very beginning, people become unemployed because of the tax. And now the government needs to hire people into the public sector and pay them for projects like working on bridges or whatever, so that the money is injected into the private sector so they can pay a portion of that, so they can pay a tax with a portion of that money. So Warren Mosler, basically what he's saying is that the imposition of a tax creates unemployment by definition, by default. So a certain amount of people are going to be unemployed, and those need to be absorbed into a federal transition job, which is just basically a job that's at the minimum wage. It would basically effectively be the minimum wage. And the people who can't be absorbed into the labor force can work there until they can get into the private sector. So this way, you'll never have unemployment. You don't need to spend any money on welfare. You could eliminate all welfare spending. You could eliminate tons of crime fighting, etc., all the causes of unemployment. You could eliminate tons and tons of government spending. And the federal job guarantee could be very cheap. It could be something like 1% of GDP or something like that. I mean, compared to what you get out of that, I think it's actually a very libertarian proposal. Also, understand, given that the imposition of a tax creates unemployment, so the government creates unemployment, so it needs to do something about that. It doesn't. The private sector can't necessarily solve it without any help, without any net private savings injections.
Sure, that makes sense. So you say transition. Does that mean there's a hard cap on this position as far as longevity goes?
No, I don't necessarily think so.
There's a hard cap for the individual.
Because the people can earn more in the private sector. So when the private sector does better, then they can hopefully hire people out of the transition job. But it doesn't necessarily have to be, doesn't have to be limited as far as job descriptions go.
Well, and then this is something important to point out because, Bernie Sanders and what's her name, the new Democratic Socialist girl that won the primary
Ocasio-cortez
in New York. Yes, her.
Yeah.
They're rolling out these federal job guarantees plans, with the $15 minimum, $15 an hour wage and the full Medicare benefits. And me and Nima actually spoke to Warren Mosler. Unfortunately, I hadn't hit the record button yet when he answered this. He said that, when he talks to the progressives, and particularly there's a group they call themselves the Real Progressives. They completely miss the point when it comes to the federal transition job, first of all, by calling it the federal job guarantee, that the purpose is not to permanently employ people. The purpose is to put something there that acts as a bridge between unemployment and the private sector. And one of the fundamental principles of it is it cannot compete with the private sector. So, for example, whatever minimum wage is now, let's say it's $10 an hour, you would put the federal transition job at like $9. So when Bernie Sanders and I forgot her name already, come out and they say, okay, Cortez, they want to pay everyone $15 an hour. Well, that would gut the lower part of the private sector.
Okay, right. Yeah.
So what's important for us to point out here, when we say the federal transition job, we are totally not saying that.
Right. Okay. No, that's very important.
Yeah.
Because tons of people, when they hear MMT, they go right there. Present company.
Yeah. And then so do the Democratic Socialists. They go right there. That's what they want.
Right. Right. We can finally afford this.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a difference here, right? Because federal jobs guarantee sounds very permanent, and what you're talking about doesn't sound as permanent.
Yeah, it literally has transition in the word. Right,
has transition in it.
The other one says guarantee.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because the next thing I was about to bring up was, okay, well, now we're talking about these minimum wages, but you've now mentioned that, so that's good to point out. So do you guys have anything off the top of your heads that stick out to you, like when Warren was critiquing, some of how the progressives word things or talk about things? Are there things that stick in your guys' craw in a similar way? When MMT gets pushed?
Actually, what annoys me most about most of the Real Progressives is all their social justice warrior virtue signaling, their anti-white messages and all that stuff, honestly. I don't know.
Yeah, that's bad.
Yeah, well, and then, they say, okay, let's nationalize the healthcare industry. Let's, I don't know, whatever the hell else they want to nationalize. They're really big into environmental stuff, and as we here know, environmentalism is just a code word for socialism when it comes to the government.
Environmentalism is actually a code word for austerity. That's the funny thing, because these people, they talk about how neoliberalism kills everyone with austerity, and here they are wishing like for giant austerity programs based on
carbon,
completely unverified, alarmism about carbon dioxide. Absolutely ridiculous. Makes no sense.
And to say that, we were talking about Venezuela before you hit the record button.
Yes.
What's super important when, we're creating money is that the private sector has to have the freedom to do something with it. And if we're so constrained with, let's say, environmentalist stuff, I've talked about real estate last time too, is, if the zoning is so nasty, you can't actually build anything. Or the regulations are so gnarly, it's like, well, you need, these 13 licenses in order to get that, to start this business. Well, no one's going to be able to do anything with the money. And then at some point, there's not going to be anything to buy because no one's producing anything.
Right.
So going back to the criticism of the Democratic Socialists, when they say nationalize something, you're putting it into the government sector. Permanently. Well, that's what you say when you say nationalize.
Right. And
all that means is more bureaucracy and more red tape.
Right.
And at some point, you're just going to strangle the system to death.
Honestly, I have to say that the U.S. healthcare system is such a giant mess of public-private patchwork that I would even go so far as saying I don't even really know. Maybe a crappy single-payer system would still be better than what we have right now.
Yeah, I could lean that way too, especially after the Obamacare for 10 years that we've had it or whatever.
Yeah, you guys don't see stuff though like that Alfie Evans story that doesn't scare the hell out of you?
Oh yeah.
Oh, it definitely scares the hell out of me. But what Nima's saying is potentially what we have now scares the hell out of him more.
It's such a monopolized economy, and basically healthcare providers have so much power and so much pricing power.
It's fascistic.
Yeah,
I think is what you're saying, right?
Yeah, and the supply is being restricted. The amount of medical educational institutions is being restricted. The amount of medical professionals is being restricted. The number of hospitals you can build is being restricted. Pharmaceuticals are protected.
Well, and even the definition of what's healthy is restricted.
Well, they're killing people, they're killing people.
Right.
Yeah, well, I mean, healthy whole grains are still good for you. Oh, saturated fat's still bad for you. Like, if we want to talk about government contracts, what about like the school lunch program that's like owned by one federal contractor? What garbage are they feeding the kids that are going to lead to health problems throughout the rest of their lives?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, simply the definition of what is healthy has been nationalized.
Well, also, we're already so overtaxed. So why go the progressive route of the MMT group? If that requires giant mobilization, giant spending, etc., if you can just change some numbers in the law, reduce the taxes, and if just conservatives and libertarians sort of, I don't want to say understand, but because it sounds condescending, but if they kind of understand that the deficit isn't really such an issue, then they would have such an easy time implementing, correct economic policy, in my opinion.
For example, imagine if the Republican Party could come out and say, you can keep your Social Security and we're going to get rid of the FICA taxes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But then, I mean, immediately the people are going to go to the math, right? Just like they do with Bernie.
Right. And that's what me and Nima are trying to help with.
Right.
Is the math is different for the issue of the currency.
Right. And I can get on.
And
go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you're rolling, bro.
Okay, so because we need a deficit, as long as we're playing this statist game where the state has a monopoly over the currency, there has to be a deficit in order for the private sector to be able to save.
Yes.
And there's in the simple world, there's two. There's actually three, but we'll leave the third one off for a second. In the simple world, there's two ways to do that. You could increase spending, or you could drop taxes. And so right now, the FICA tax is probably the most brutal tax that we have in the country. It punishes everybody. It punishes the employee. It punishes the business owner, because then it's just self-employment tax, an extra 15.2% out of your income, and it punishes the bigger business for hiring anybody else. Punishes everybody, and it turns out it pays for nothing. In the most literal sense, it pays for nothing. So the fuck is it doing there? Now,
making it harder.
Yeah, well, and we could talk about whether or not Social Security is a great system or not, which I don't think it is, and I don't think anybody on right now thinks it is. However, if we could separate the fact that paying out Social Security and collecting FICA taxes aren't actually connected to each other, we can address them one at a time.
It's a fiction.
Right. So these connections, like, again, something we were talking about off mic, is when you start, after I started talking to you guys, I go and have conversations with other people. Well, this pays for this. And I'm like, don't be so sure.
Yeah.
Well, and then, I just thought of another thing where I see the danger from the Democratic Socialists is they say taxation actually has another function. So the first function is it gives value to the money. The second function is it acts as a way of removing money out of the system. But the third function is it can be used to redistribute resources or redistribute wealth.
Right.
So if someone gets too rich, we could take it away from them.
Well, also it can be used as punishment.
That too. Fourth one.
Right. Well, it's essentially
I forgot about that one.
It's essentially the same thing. Right.
Yeah, but when he's saying punishment, he's like, punishing people for smoking cigarettes. So we put a tax on cigarettes, not because we want the money, because we don't, theoretically, we don't want people to smoke.
Behavior.
It's a sin tax.
Yeah. So, but with the Democratic Socialists, they say we still need to tax rich people because they just shouldn't be rich. That they still have this Marxist idea that, they're just getting rich off the backs of the employees who do all the work anyway. And if we just took Amazon and split it up into 10 employee-owned companies, we would be able to do the same thing.
Well, it's like you can
any business owner's like, oh my God, did I just hear that?
I know, it's funny. So you hear, it's interesting, right? So I can talk to you guys, and I'm like, okay, all right, okay, I get it. And then I hear MMT coming out of like Cortez. Have you heard her talk about the tax cuts?
No.
So
no.
She talks about the tax cuts in a way to where she takes the total amount that is no longer being taxed. And she's like basically making arguments that like, oh, we just took that out of the economy. Like we just took that off the table. Right. And so that's kind of like the dangers of MMT when it's framed from.
Wait,
I'm totally confused.
That's like the opposite
of MMT.
No, it is. And I'm probably like, I'm probably saying it wrong. Man, I wish I had.
Well, and how old is this girl?
Poorly.
How old is this girl?
Oh, she's in her young 20s.
Okay, I have the distinct suspicion that she's a dumb cunt that doesn't know what she's talking about and is simply repeating things that other people have told her.
Oh, probably.
Sneaking suspicion. I might be wrong, but I'd bet on it.
Yeah, probably. Because she talks about it from a weight of. It's just, that's like you said. It's the dangers of this obsession with class warfare, because she's seeing it as like a necessary punishment to the upper class to keep things equal and even. And that's when it gets really scary.
The upper class being that business owner that actually made like $200,000 one year or something.
Right. Either that, or I mean, these evil people that like hire other people to work. It gets crazy. Yeah. But when it gets into it, it's bad. So, all right. When we talk about stuff, so one of the things I've noticed with the MMT crowd that libertarians don't have is oftentimes I'll see libertarians are really, really good at complaining about stuff. they've got that down, right? Like no one has mastered complaining about the government quite as well as the libertarians have. But a lot of
they're trying to transmute into Japanese women. Don't tell my wife I said that.
Caught me off guard there. But and not all of them do this, right? So I'm not trying to, libertarians that are listening, don't get so mad at me. You guys might not be this way, but
get mad at him. Fuck you guys. You complain about everything.
But they're not always good at prescribing things and suggesting solutions. And this is actually something that I see the MMT crowd do a lot of. So I wanted to talk to both of you guys about, and I believe, Dylan, you are also a libertarian of sorts too, right? Yeah.
I consider myself an and anarchist.
Right, exactly. So I would love to hear from you guys some prescriptions, right? So you supporters of MMT, also libertarians. So then we know what the Democratic.
Well, and I gotta interrupt you. We're not supporters of MMT.
Well, observers.
We've observed the fact that it's accurate.
Right, but you know what I'm saying. Sorry, I phrased it wrong.
No, I know what you're saying, but it's an important distinction, because when you say support, it sounds like, I support a higher minimum wage. I support this political action. I support families being together, or I support feminists. So, it's more of an opinion thing, whereas it's what we're saying. And if we're inaccurate, it's a factual thing, that this is the factual way that the economy and monetary systems function.
Yeah, but I mean,
it's not a matter of whether we like it or not, or whether we support it.
But it still has theory in the name, right? Like, it's not modern monetary objectivism.
Dude, gravity has theory in its name. The only time that you see the word theorem is in pure mathematics. The Big Bang has theory in its name.
We're drifting.
Thermodynamics have theory in their names.
Yeah.
Yes, you are.
Okay. I'm being a grammar Nazi over here.
Either way, I'd like to hear. So we hear plenty of what the Democratic Socialists would like to do with MMT. What do you guys see as being an optimal economy?
For me, I would say we could have, like, if it doesn't have to be a huge change or whatever, we can have a small government that limits itself to protecting the borders and the people inside, and reduce spending accordingly, and also reduce taxes even more so. The only important thing in the end is that there's a deficit, so that your net private savings accumulated, etc. And so I'm all for just cutting taxes drastically and reducing the size of the government to the extent possible. The problem there is, different people have different opinions on that, so ultimately it's a political decision. But technically, just financially, economic policy-wise, I would say lower taxes drastically and then reduce the government size along with it. But you don't have to go, you don't have to reduce the size as much as the taxation necessarily. Just, enough to where you have full employment. So there's enough net private savings injected into the economy.
So when you talk about reducing government size, what are some things in the government that you personally think could be eliminated, that we could do without? And what are some things that you think shouldn't be done without?
I think we could get rid of the
IRS.
I think we get rid of the IRS, Hallelujah. The FBI, the EPA, a lot of the military spending, bring all the troops home, and there's just there's so much.
Well, there's also the fact that most. What about most?
No covert agencies, no CIA, any of that nonsense. And
so none of the alphabet soup agencies.
Yeah, I mean, there's some that have been there for like forever. They're real intelligence agencies like Navy and Army intelligence. But the CIA is just a total rogue, just an insane rogue agency. There's no reason for it to be there. Caused so much trouble and harm to the world. So that one would definitely. So many things we could get rid of that would totally don't do anything good in the world, and we could lower our taxes significantly, and we could live in a much better country, much better world ultimately, I think.
Yeah, that'd be nice. That'd be real nice. Get rid of that IRS. I'm with it. How about you, Dylan? Same question.
So I think I mentioned this last time. I kind of have a short-term version, a medium-term version, and a long-term version. The short-term version is do whatever it takes not to cause austerity. Because contrary to what someone like Peter Schiff is going around proselytizing, which is that, the sooner the crash occurs, the better, because then we'll graduate into something better. Well, if you don't understand how the monetary system works, I don't think that's accurate. And by saying, I hope the crash comes sooner, is just wishing untold misery upon massive populations for no good reason. So whatever need...
Except for the bankers.
Yeah, except for them. My favorite peoples.
Right.
So if you got to increase the spending, if you got to decrease taxes, and the third one, which we haven't really talked about, is if you got to change the trade deficit, because a country that exports goods imports money. Whatever has to get done, do it. Medium term, what Nima said, where we could say, okay, why don't we just start gutting all these taxes and removing as much government as we possibly can? Let's go back and look at the different founding father discussions where they're really discussing what is the bare bones that are necessary here. Now, I understand that we live in a more modern time and the bare bones may be a little bit different, but we could still apply the same principles to that. Long term, and when I say long term, I'm talking we're all dead, our kids are dead, and possibly our grandchildren are dead. Private currencies starting to overtake government. And I have no idea what that would look like. And I have no idea how the transition would look. That's just the principle to aim towards, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. I think I agree. Like Mosler suggested in one of our calls with him, we could just eliminate all income taxes, just have a universal property tax across the board, and not even have to track people anymore. You don't even need to track people's incomes or anything like that. The property, if tax isn't paid on the property, you can just sell the property. So, it would be possible. It's realistic to implement. And it would be in line with MMT, so something along those lines.
That's almost...
I think would work wonders.
I hear a lot of similar... Are you guys familiar with Milton Friedman?
Yeah.
I hear a lot of similarities here with some of his prescriptions.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Friedman had also said... obviously he's against taxation, right? Yeah. As a minimal government guy.
Okay. Yeah.
And he used to say that if there is to be a tax, the most reasonable he found is the land tax.
Well, yeah, because every other tax is just a pass through to the consumer. Even the corporate tax in a competitive industry is just a pass through to the consumer. It's all reflected in the prices ultimately.
Right. So that's kind of Georgism, right? Which is essentially the same thing, just the land tax.
Yeah, I guess.
Well, and then I think it's worth emphasizing the fact of not having to chase people around and track them.
Yeah.
Because, if you got rid of the IRS, imagine all the tax accountants and attorneys and bookkeepers that could actually do something useful with their lives. And all the bullshit all the time we spend, saving receipts and, deducting stuff and sweating about our taxes and making sure our bank accounts are right and signing like 80 million things and getting audited and all that stuff gone.
Boy, that'd be nice.
At least on the federal level.
Yeah.
Where, like he said, with a property tax, the government, the county doesn't even care who pays it. They just want to make sure it's paid. You can just pay online. They don't even ask if you own the property or not.
Right. Right. You just get a letter.
At least in my county.
No, it's the same here. You get a letter. You can respond to it with anything. As long as there's money in it.
There would be no administrative cost to implement a federal tax like this, because all the tracking mechanisms are in place already.
Yeah. And so to further the Milton Friedman thing, so he had a suggestion of, I mean, it was kind of like a UBI, but it wasn't. It was this negative income tax, which is different from what is being prescribed in the, make sure I say it right, the federal transition job programs. Did I get that right?
Yeah, there's no welfare there. Yeah.
You did.
Yeah, is it? Yeah, that's exactly right, Nima. Is it eliminates the welfare stuff? So that was Milton Friedman's argument for his negative income taxes. You would do that in place of all of these social programs. So even though it's can be considered a UBI and there's a cost to that, it's eliminating costs in the welfare stuff. So there's similar argumentation there in that, yes, it is a cost, but it also comes with a great elimination of costs as well.
Right.
So one of the things that I did here too is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, which I'm sure you will, is so Mosler talked about having medical with these jobs, correct?
He did, and honestly, I want to talk to him about that, because even if you have a federal transition job that's under the minimum wage, so it doesn't compete with the private sector, if you're offering full medical,
right? Okay, yes, this is.
I mean, I don't think anyone cares about that, that dollar difference anymore.
Right. That's where the transition part becomes a little harder to sell.
Yeah, I gotta ask, or we gotta ask about that. I'm not sure. I don't know.
Well, that's what I was talking about earlier too. When you get to the leanings, like the different, yes, people do lean differently, but his leanings tend to have stuff like that come with some of these prescriptions and policies. I do like that we're having this conversation though, because it's good to hear different views here. It's because I think that it's hard for people to pick apart the different opinions of different people that talk about MMT.
Right. I think the big picture, MMT, just, you can go two ways. You can, the lefty way is increase spending, and the righty way is to cut taxes.
Right. Yeah. And then you've got the super left, which is to increase spending and then
Green
punish.
New Deal.
Oh, gosh. So, okay. So we've talked about your ideal MMT construct. So what do you see as super dangerous from some people that talk about MMT on the left side of things? What do you guys see as some things that could really lead to bad stuff?
I see the left, even though they understand the concept that you have to have a federal deficit, if you just keep strangling the private sector by, ripping people out of it and, putting them permanently in a federal guaranteed job and increasing the environmental regulations to the point where the private sector can't do anything, I
think that's one of the most dangerous things I see to answer the questions. That they're all a lot of them are totally down with completely ridiculous environmental propaganda. So when given lots of money, God help us with what they're going to do with that based on their ideologies. But also, I think a big healthcare program, we have no idea what could happen from that. I think it would be much easier to deregulate and make it more competitive versus just make a giant healthcare program. And what do? Do you keep the existing corporations? Are they still going to be supplying these companies? And you're giving them a huge windfall potentially. So they're just going to become more powerful, more monopolistic, more oppressive. These are all kinds of possible scenarios that I see as far as these progressive MMT programs.
Right, and that's precisely what I was hoping to get to, right? And so I think the medical industry is a great example of this. We talked a little bit earlier about how worried I'm sure all of us are with a lot of the costs in the medical industry right now. Very concerned, and so an MMT are getting a hold of things as far as monetary policy or economic policy goes, and just deciding, look, just keep it the way it is, but just pump way more money into it. I can't imagine that's gonna.
Yeah, it's insane.
Yeah, that's insane. Insane for prices. So then we lead to something else that a lot of people talk about when they talk about the dangers of this kind of thing. So inflation, it's a slippery slope, and it can get away from folks pretty quick. in an economic sense. So what are some ways that you think inflation can be triggered this way, and what are some ways you think it can be protected from?
Well, I think that inflation actually, like, you know, the disaster scenarios that we've heard of, they don't happen in the manner that you just described, where it just starts and it gets out of hand. But so I think inflation per se isn't really a big danger until you're at full capacity, and the U.S. economy isn't anywhere near full capacity. The only reason why deficit spending would create inflation is if the spending is on military and other sectors where you have specialized labor. So you're bidding up specialized labor that's very rare. But if you had like a federal jobs guarantee, you wouldn't be causing much inflation from the deficit spending. You would just be creating new consumers and new purchasing power that was artificially suppressed before because of the tax levels being too high. So, you know, at one point when we have a full employment economy, a real full employment economy with decent jobs, and it's absolutely booming more than we can imagine right now, then we may hit a point where the additional deficit spending starts creating inflation. And then that should be dealt with through the budgetary process. The government should reduce its spending, in my opinion. You know, some people might say, well, they can also raise taxes, but I'd rather not, you know, because that reduces the wealth and size of the private sector.
So would you then say that, like, in that scenario, austerity measures might not be the worst thing?
Yeah. In the scenario where you're starting to create inflation by bidding out resources out of the private sector, then you should do austerity in the sense that you impose austerity on the government. Technically. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, because, you know, austerity, as far as I understand it, is typically a word used when they really mean you need to balance your budget.
Yeah.
You need to stop having a debt. Whereas I think the way Neem is saying it is slowing down the deficit a little bit.
Yeah.
Sure. That makes sense.
And there's a big difference between the two.
Yeah. Okay. Do you think that the people that are currently in power in Washington right now could handle taking, like, just the power of modern monetary theory? Do you think we would just go careening into a hellhole?
Well,
So,
sorry.
I was gonna say, first of all, I think the neoliberals get it, or at least some of them, and I think because they're like secretly reptilians or fucking something. I don't know. Because they're so fucking evil,
right?
They want to use it against everybody. That was a joke on the reptilians, everybody. Just except for George Soros, who seems to have forgotten how to change back into his human
Dylan's
form.
going to be on InfoWars next week.
No, David
Right,
Icke.
there you go.
So, I think that there's some higher up that really understand how it works, and they use it negatively.
Well, I mean,
on the population.
If you read history books like Tragedy and Hope, the big picture analysis, they always look at this just as a strategy. And he writes how, okay, they chose deflation for the following reasons, or they chose an inflation strategy for the following reasons. So it seems like historians in the big picture, they're aware of all of this, you know?
So that's kind of the idea there, is that they already know.
Yeah, they do it for deliberate reasons.
Well, now, however, I think on, let's say, the lower levels of the upper echelons of Washington State, or not Washington State, Washington, D.C. I live in Washington State. That's why I made that mistake.
Yep.
The politicians on the right don't know this. And as Nima has pointed this out in previous conversations on my channel, that the economic crashes
on the left also.
Oh, you mean the lower echelons of the lower sides of the upper echelons of Washington, D.C.?
Well, just from what I know from Warren Mosler, who has talked to a lot of these people, he says on both sides they're equally ignorant. Okay. I mean, I don't know about exactly equally. Yeah, I mean, you may be right that there's more on the conservative side.
Yeah, well, because, I mean, the conservative side, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like the libertarian philosophizing is what leaks into the conservative mindset.
Yes.
And they're the ones that say, okay, a budget should be balanced. We shouldn't spend on things that we couldn't afford. Yeah. We shouldn't do these sorts of things. Now, of course, as soon as they're in power, they don't do any of that.
Right.
And the libertarians and you know, the radical, the more libertarian they are, the more they're actually pro-deflation. So in the grand scheme of things, they're really just deflationary apologists.
Brutal. That's a hard pill to swallow. So,
right.
Speaking of the libertarians and their economic prescriptions, we've talked about the progressives, and so where do the libertarians get it way wrong? Let us have it. Where?
I think with
go ahead.
The barter theory of money.
It all starts with the barter theory of money, but then from there, you know, ultimately, that's why they believe that the budget should be balanced, and the balanced budget. I think that's really the idea that you can have a sustainably growing and wealthy economy with balanced budgets is not really true, or not universally applicable, not empirically supported. You can have it if you have export surpluses, but not otherwise. You're pretty much guaranteeing depression or a big recession if you try to go for policies like that. And in the grand historic scheme of things, these policies are just known as deflationary policies, and they're crippling the private sector and the economy in the long term. So I would say, just, you know, don't do those policies.
Stop! Don't do that.
Well, and then I think if we go to the Peter Schiffs, or even you know, Stefan Molyneux will reflect this attitude, is that we should encourage the crash and speed it up so we can get it over with.
Right. What's actually more likely is if we have an economic depression or economic recession or whatever crash, you're going to get the most authoritarian government you've ever seen.
That I can agree with completely.
You know? So you want that much less than anything.
Right, because when things fall, I mean, that's right. Like, we all walk around praising the quote from Hayek, right? I don't remember the quote exactly. Shame on me, but it's emergencies are always, you know, the pretext in which we get the most egregious erosions of liberty.
Yes.
Well, yeah, or as Rahm Emanuel said,
never let a good crisis go to waste.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, I think that's a great point.
Let me
go ahead, please. Sorry.
Did you want to finish that? I was going to criticize Austrian.
Oh no, I was just there was just a pat on the back. I think that's a great point. Is why don't be so quick to push an economic crisis if we all admit that times of emergency are when the government goes for the worst power grabs.
Right.
Also for the economic or the Austrian economic side of things, and I know I keep criticizing Peter Schiff, but he is the guy who like can't go 15 seconds without like a Tourette's. It's gonna crash. It's gonna crash. Play gold. It's gonna crash.
No, man. Let it out, man. Let it out.
My exorcist will be here in an hour. So, there's this idea from the Austrian perspective that Armageddon is fundamentally built into the economic system.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, the misallocation of resources necessitates a future crash, and without it, we can't get the resources realigned to proper usage.
And the removal from the gold standard speeds that up.
Yeah.
Because
we're just constantly in a state of false resource allocation, and it's just all bound to explode. And if it doesn't explode tomorrow, then it's going to be an even worse explosion in 2 weeks. It's always what you hear from these people. Peter Schiff, best example.
And again, Peter Schiff, the interest rates went down. That means it's going to crash. Oh, the interest rates went up. That means it's going to crash. Oh, the spending went up. It's going to crash. Oh, the taxes went down. It's going to crash. It's like every avenue points to the same thing.
Right.
according to this. And I mean, if you work off the assumptions that Nima was just pointing out, I guess it's true, but those are the false assumptions, which is what we're bringing up, is it doesn't work that way.
Yes.
Sure. Okay. So, and to be clear, when you talk about the barter theory, you talked about a bit of what we were touching on in the last episode, correct? When you
Yes.
assume that before a government, people just had a currency that they used and everything was fine.
Yes.
Or they had markets.
Right.
There isn't
They exchanged
evidence for
chickens.
markets.
They exchanged chickens for goats and seashells for coffee beans. And in a super efficient market process, they arrived at gold and silver as their monetary tokens. And then the government came in to ruin it all. That's that fictional story that's at the root at a lot of, neoclassical economics. Just because Adam Smith imagined it in his book, Wealth of Nations, I think, or one of his books.
No, that's it. That's it.
Well, and then to talk about Adam Smith for a little bit, I don't remember if I mentioned this last time. So Adam Smith came up with the concept of the invisible hand, right?
Yes.
Which is essentially that, in a marketplace where you don't have violence occurring, there's going to be an, in quotes, higgling and biggling of the market where everyone's going to try to get the most stuff for the smallest price. And that this is a natural thing that occurs. That's why, in quotes, the invisible hand, because you can't really point at it and say, there it is. Well, in another book that he wrote, I believe called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, he wrote that he came up with this idea in order to have something that was similar to Newton's theories of motion, because this is a very deistic idea, because the big thinkers at the time were all deists, which was this idea that there's no such thing as miracle, and that the universe could be understood through universal principles. And it was Isaac Newton who really kicked this idea off, that there was such a thing as universal principles that we can understand the universe by. And Adam Smith wanted an economic universal principle. Unfortunately, he just made it up. Well, and now, giving Adam Smith some credit, didn't he found the school of economics, or the concept of economics?
Well,
as we discuss it in modern times,
he I think basically started neoclassical economic thinking, but yeah, I don't know.
It's not his fault that everyone took the idea and ran with it. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Right.
No, yeah, I'm not sure if it started there.
It's it makes sense. It's very intuitive. I always thought it made sense until I read about it. There's actually no proof of it.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. I didn't. So that's the thing I have to look into more. I wish I could speak more on it. Unfortunately, I think Dylan, you're the most knowledgeable on the history of these things.
Well, so, and then let me say this to try to make it a little bit more real, because when you look at stuff like the stock market, or you look at the crypto trading programs and bond rates and foreign exchange stuff, and you see this thing where people have posted buy sell trades, and they have limits and stop limits and all this sort of stuff, where it is exactly that. There does appear to be an invisible hand, because everybody's trying to get the most they can with the least amount of money, and there's people whose full-time profession it is to do that. Like how do we play with these numbers to get the most we can for the least amount possible? Now, that's in a situation where every unit is equally convertible with each other, and there isn't any real emotional attachment to that thing. Now, in day-to-day life, most people, they don't buy off of reason, they buy off of emotion. They want to feel good about the thing that they purchased. So most people, when they're going through their day-to-day, I mean, I know we all know that one person who is totally higgling and biggling with everything all the time.
Right.
But generally speaking, people just like aren't on the internet all day comparing prices for everything.
Sure.
Or you know, when they go to buy something, just like arguing with the person and just like, how do I get this as cheap as possible? A lot of people won't value something unless they've paid a certain amount of money for it. This is Edward L. Bernays, you know, the guy who literally wrote the book Propaganda. I listened to an interview with him once, I guess, you know, right before he died, and someone asked him about, you know, how he got people to take him seriously, because, you know, he would have clients come to him in order to give them consulting on subjects that he may or may not have known anything about. And he said, well, the first thing I did is I charged them a ton of money.
A lot of money, yeah.
Because if I didn't, they wouldn't take my advice. The fact that they paid me a lot of money made them want to get something for their money. If they didn't pay me very much, I would just be some guy telling them what to do.
Right. Why listen to the guy you paid $5 for? It's just $5. Who cares?
Right. Right. So when it comes to back to this invisible hand, that's a very extremely rational approach to buying and selling things, which people buy off their emotions. They don't buy off their reason.
I think an easy way to put it is just that in the private economy, prices, or in the consumer goods economy, prices are often administered from the top down, whereas in an auction system, like the stock prices you were describing, prices are, you know, very efficient. So you know, a lot of people make the mistake of equating the two. They think the private market, consumer market price system works in an auction process when it doesn't. It's a top-down administered process, which is a little different.
You said that way better than I did.
So is it safe to say that, or maybe it's not safe to say, how do you guys feel about pegged currencies? How do you guys feel about backed currencies like the gold or silver?
It's like cutting your arm off for no reason.
Well, they're not really currencies, I think. You know, they're precious metals. Are you talking about the gold standard?
Well, just I use those as an example. Just pegged currencies in general.
Well, yeah, they are. I think they're problematic because that is a system where the government can actually become insolvent, and for no other reason than because they can't keep the price of a particular commodity stabilized. So it's really usually, you know, a pegged fiat money system is really just another fiat money system where the government guarantees the price of a certain commodity or security or currency. So it's arbitrary. It's really just government intervention in the free market system, if you will. And it's doesn't usually end well. It always ends with hyperinflation, it seems. You know, if Germany was pegged, Weimar Germany was pegged to gold, and then hyperinflation. Zimbabwe had their currency pegged to the dollar, ended in hyperinflation. You know, Ukraine,
Venezuela was pegged to the dollar as well.
Yeah, Venezuela had some U.S. dollar loans, I guess, because they operate with the dollar in their oil incomes. But so, I mean, it just doesn't work very well. It's like it is ultimately always suspended by the government right when it would be needed most to restrict or supposedly restrict the government's actions. But then what's the point if it's always abolished when it's needed and useless when it's not needed? You know, then it's not really no point to it. But also just conceptually, it's just there's really no logical reason to having those. You know, there's no logical reason to fixing the price of a commodity by government decree, other than for the people who want that price to be fixed because they're from that lobby or whatever.
And an example to that, Randy Ray writes this in his book, Monetary Theory Primer, that you can attack a country with a pegged currency system, and George Soros has actually done this to the United Kingdom at some point in history. I don't remember the specifics. I think the United Kingdom had pegged the pound to the dollar.
No, it was because as part of the European Union, all the different currencies had to fluctuate within a certain range, and he just forced the British pound outside of that range against the other European currencies. Part of the reason why the UK never went on the euro.
So yeah, you could have a single player smashing governments around if the currency's pegged.
Well, that's suboptimal. Probably not a good thing. So I have to imagine the Nima, you're probably, it sounds like logically, you would be a pretty big supporter of the crypto movement.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's why I've been involved in Bitcoin since 2011. I've invested a lot in crypto. I've worked in crypto. I own a crypto site called coinjabber.com.
Oh, okay. Wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah. No, I'm fascinated with it.
Yeah, I am too. It's very I guess the interesting part for me in all of this is because we talk about, like, I'll say, like, libertarians, and kind of use it as a broad sense, and even Austrians, and use it as in a broad sense, right? But, like, for instance, like what we were talking about, like Milton Friedman was a libertarian, and it sounds like there's a lot of compatible ideas here between what you guys are saying and what Milton Friedman says. And Milton Friedman, even, like, if you look at, for instance, like two different libertarian approaches at the Great Depression, you've got, like, Rothbard, who kind of holds that opinion that you guys are saying is, like, the most dangerous one, that kind of like the Peter Schiff type approach, that outlook.
Yeah, I've read his book about the Great Depression.
Yeah. So he's kind of got that outlook. But then you've got, like, Friedman, who really just kind of criticizes the Fed more. He just kind of says, like, they operated incorrectly there. That could have been avoided if they would have taken a different strategy toward the
monetary policy. Well, and MMT could have just told you, if you have a government budget surplus, you're going to have a depression, and that's exactly what happened before the Great Depression. You had a government budget surplus, and that's the same thing that happened before any other depression, by the way.
And to that point, then you've got even Hayek, right, who even goes even further to saying that the next logical step is private currencies. Essentially, a free market for money is the most optimal next step.
Yeah, true. Monetary Reconstruction is his book, I believe.
Yeah, Hayek's great. I'm a big fan. I'm sure the people listening right now are rolling their eyes. Yeah. It's not the first time I've mentioned it. But yeah, I bring that up to mention. I think it's easy to get stuck in these generalizations, like Austrians or libertarians do this or that. And there's actually been a lot of famous thinkers who I think that this theory is actually kind of compatible with. It sounds to me, if you'd have approached Milton Friedman, or if you'd have approached Friedrich Hayek with these ideas, you'd probably find more agreements than disagreements. But that is also... Yeah,
I agree.
But that is also to say that if you approached, probably like Hans Hermann Hoppe or Murray Rothbard with these ideas, that you probably wouldn't meet such a welcoming audience.
Well, Randy Ray, again, in the same book I mentioned before, actually, he had quite a few examples. I can't remember them off the top of my head, that after World War II, there was a lot of economists really starting to think in this way. And for some reason, they just went to the wayside. I can't remember what he said the reasoning was, but there was a lot of economists back at the time after World War II saying, we got to have a deficit in order to have money to spend.
So what do you think does keep people from being able to embrace this completely? What do you think is keeping, at least?
I think it's conditioning.
You think so?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, or just bad theories. It was, in my case, I didn't always believe this stuff. So I think in most cases, just coming around or doing a research and weighing the quality of the different theories.
Because this has got to be terrifying for you guys as people that think the way you do economically, and then you go look at these arguments going on the left and right. Fighting.
Well, it's not terrifying because we used to make the same arguments.
Well, terrifying in the sense of, like, what, or from your standpoint, what actions will lead, what will come of certain actions, and people.
I actually find it more hopeful because I used to accept the Austrian viewpoint that the Armageddon was built into the economic system. And with that viewpoint, I was very nihilistic, where it's like,
I
why
agree.
do anything if it's all going to crash?
I mean, that's what you see from most Austrians. They're like most like people like Peter Schiff. It's always just their entire life is spent waiting for Armageddon, so that gold goes up to $20,000. Seems to me, sometimes.
Or that they go out in the woods in the middle of nowhere in New Hampshire, thinking that they're creating Libertopia or Ancapistan, and they don't actually do anything productive in the world because they're just like, I'm going to hide out in the woods and have my food and have my gold and have my Bitcoin, and I'm going to be good and I'm going to survive.
You're talking about the Free State Project? I
just assumed there was a lot of libertarians up in New Hampshire thinking that way.
No, I think that...
Yeah, I've heard about the Free State Project. I just don't know that much about it.
A free keen.
Yeah, I think they all, like a whole bunch of libertarians went out to...
Oh, yeah, I think I have some friends who are from there, who went there.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty cool story. But either way, I think there's some merit to what you're saying. I know a few of these guys. I know a guy personally. We've had him on the show before, Kyle Wagner. He talked about he got into libertarianism basically from fear of this giant economic Armageddon that's on its way.
Yeah.
Like his whole reason for being into libertarianism is because he thinks that he's convinced that this economic Armageddon is coming, and we need to figure out how we're...
And there's no stopping it.
And we need to figure out how we're going to pick things up after it all falls down.
And so... And which I was in the same boat. And now that I understand MMT and I see, oh my God, we can avoid the whole thing literally by adjusting some numbers. And I mean that in the most literal sense. As Nima pointed out, if we take the, in quotes, right-leaning MMT policy suggestions, which is let's just drop the taxes. That's just changing some fucking numbers in a tax code.
Right.
That's it.
Also, in terms of behavioral changes, thanks to MMT, I've been much more open to having a very diversified portfolio. So the end effect is actually that no matter what economic disaster or boom occurs, I always benefit. But I'm not so arrogant to think that I know that Armageddon is just around the corner. So I make better and less politically motivated decisions for my investments.
I always thought, and you touched on to something, even breaking away from an economic conversation. I always found that interesting. You have these people that are always so convinced that something is going to crumble on their watch. And I always thought that too, and I was surprised. I've been surprised at why other people don't think that. So it's refreshing to hear you say that, Nima. That like, why are people so narcissistic as to think that the world is going to end on their watch?
Right.
Like
because they think they're very important people.
Right. What makes us so special that something that monumental is going to happen?
Exactly.
In our limited time here.
Yeah. A lot of things don't have to happen with a bang. They don't understand. Fabian socialism operates by incrementalism. Oftentimes it's not a big bang, but the assault on us is omnipresent, I think. It's just sometimes just slow and sort of war of attrition style.
Yeah, an erosion over time. Sorry, I think I interrupted you there, Dylan.
No, I didn't have anything productive to say at that point, but I did want to say this based off of Fabian socialism, is I think... I'm not even going to say people on the right. I'm going to say people interested in freedom have a lot to learn from the Fabian socialists, particularly now that we're in an era of internet and podcasting and YouTubing and social media, where there is a much more realistic possibility of just anybody being able to attain political office. Is why can't we use this war of attrition idea that the Fabian socialists came up with in the other direction? So we say, okay, I'm going to remove one more regulation.
Yeah, no, I'm down with it. This is something that I talk about all the time, and I think it's really interesting that you brought this up. I just posted, we got this little closed group. I'll even invite you to it if you'd like to. I posed this question, right? Like I said, you can't just replace a complicated structure of mechanisms and apparatuses that are responsible for the quality of life that you have today with nothing and assume assume amazing results will come from it. So I actually...
No, the free market will just figure it out.
Right. That, you know, well, this is...
Have you met the people in the free market, dude?
Right. Well, and it touches on something that we said before we got started. There's a couple things that you said when you were like, "Oh, the government is evil." And I think that's probably the wrong outlook to have, right? I don't think that the government is 100% pure evil. I don't think that like anything that I think that the government mismanages things on large, enormously horrible scales.
Can I say this? Can I explain what I meant by that? Which is
Sure, absolutely.
By evil, I mean they have the monopoly on the use of force. Therefore, anything they do, if we go from the non-aggression principle, is immoral. That's what I meant by evil.
Oh no, absolutely. I was just kind of echoing
in the absolute sense.
Right. Well, I was kind of echoing your sentiment in that you know, not everything has to be so absolute, right? Like people probably don't like fraud, right? And libertarians, I think, argue from this standpoint all the time, where it's just like government bad, no matter what. And it's like, yes, I agree with you that there are some very bad things that the government does.
Well,
but you know, go ahead.
I think I totally agree with you. I think it's almost over the past 2 years, for some reason, I started believing or started thinking more along the lines that there's just bad ideas and evil spirits, and they're everywhere. You know, they're in people in government, but they're also in people in corporations, and they're in people in social organizations. They're in people who are in nonprofits. It's just omnipresent. So you don't just fix it by getting rid of one institution that happens to have a lot of these evil elements in it, because you just have this spirit all over the place. You know, by spirit I mean the belief system and the manipulative nature, the psychopathic nature. It's almost like there's people who are communicating above all else, above everyone, everything else in secret, and so that's where problem.
Right. And no, and you're absolutely right. And in some got tripped up there. In some senses, I think the government protects from that, or it attempts to. I can absolutely with confidence say it attempts to, right?
Well, and in theory, the United States government was designed to protect from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in my opinion, to just say government is completely evil no matter what is a little foolish, because at the end of the day, I think people generally like being able to know that they have some protection from fraud and violence. Now, granted, other people, their perception of protection from violence is probably less, basing off of the neighborhood you live in. I will admit that certain cops in certain neighborhoods probably tend to give a lot less confidence to the people living in those neighborhoods than others. But my whole point was just to say that, you know, just going out and decrying, burn it down, tear it down, blow it up. We talk about it with in the circles I run, and we talk about it as the Rothbard button, right? And we basically say, if you're able to push a button, or the Rothbard button, and nuke all forms of government, would you do it? My answer is no. I wouldn't do it. I'm still an anarchist, though. Right. Is your answer no as well?
The answer is no, because similar as what we said earlier, well, the only result would be that you would just have something worse. You would have a dictatorship, because the belief system still hasn't changed. So you cannot expect much change from just bombing things or blowing existing institutions up. The society has to be ready for anarcho-capitalism if you want that system.
Right. And there's... Oh, go ahead, please.
You might want to finish that. I was gonna change the direction of the conversation just a little bit. It relates to what we're speaking about now, but we'll definitely leave economics if I go that way.
Please, go ahead. We've covered a bunch.
So, one of the big influences, literary influences that I had on my life was actually Frank Herbert. Have you read much Frank Herbert? The guy who wrote Dune?
I haven't.
I've read Dune, and that's about it.
I've played the video game, if that counts. I played the computer game.
I've
on the
PC. So, one of the themes that Frank Herbert seems to have in all of his books is he looks at there's this adage that, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And he says, no. Power attracts the corruptible. And in Dune, or I should say the Dune series, because you start to see more of this in the later books, the Bene Gesserit are extremely well-minded toward those who enjoy power. And there's this scene, I can't remember if it's in the fifth or the sixth book in the Dune series, where the woman who ends up becoming the head of the Bene Gesserit kind of remembers a situation in her life when she was young and training, where she was in, they call it an ornithopter, but it's something, it's like a helicopter. She was learning how to fly a helicopter, and there was a man teaching her and another woman how to fly. And the other woman went kind of power crazy and took over and started flying around with the guitar. I was playing my guitar earlier today. Flying around with the helicopter against what the guy teaching her was telling her to do. And she started yelling at him, "You have to listen to me. I'm Bene Gesserit. You have to listen to me." And that was a sign that woman could never be put in a powerful position her entire life ever. And that the Bene Gesserit social system was designed entirely around that. Identify who cannot handle the power and never let them have it. And I think this is a very accurate assessment of humans. That there are those, if you give them the power, they will just swing it around like a warhammer the instant they get it at anything that they please. With what they please being the only criteria of how they swing it. Now, currently, as a species, we really suck at recognizing that in other people. We're really, really bad at it. We are so obsessed with what words people are saying, we completely ignore their actions. And we have very, very little framework in which to understand it and identify it. And I've been slacking off, but I personally feel like I have developed a system which, it's not perfect, but it'll help us understand how to identify people like this. My channel was supposed to be dedicated toward that, and I ended up spending more of my time on economics with Nima. But if we can get our society to a point where we could start recognizing when people are actually using power versus when they're actually being reasonable, and have people take the side of those being reasonable, we will finally be in the position where we can practically contemplate a free society. But until that happens, like you were saying, if we push the Rothbard button, the psychopaths are going to get control immediately.
Yeah.
And then the narcissists are going to go crazy, and the sociopaths are going to go crazy. I mean, whatever pop psychology word we want to throw out there is a real situation where people will go crazy with power, and it's difficult to detect. They can fake an altruistic nature, I should say.
Right.
So, personally, and I think Stefan Molyneux is focused on this. He's never been described in the way I just said it, but because he's so geared toward child raising and understanding, like, okay, the way you treat the child is kind of the way they're going to be the rest of their life, so let's figure out how to do that the right way. We need to be focused on creating the population that can handle it before we can pretend that we're ever actually going to get it.
I'll tell you what, if you want to get a good idea of how someone acts with power, just spend some time in the family court system. A little bit.
Spend some time in a family.
Oh my God.
There's a lot of people who know exactly what I'm talking about, where if you have a narcissistic parent, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's the delight in the humiliation and subjugation of others. And the jealousy of somebody else gaining self-control. And particularly with the narcissist, I know most people speak about psychopaths, and maybe there's some overlap with these two things. But particularly with the narcissist, they are grand masters at faking empathy.
Oh, yeah. Big time.
And faking rational discussion.
Yeah, they're great at marketing.
And if you don't have the tools to recognize it, they will suck you in and spit you out like nobody's business.
Right, like they were getting paid for it.
Yes. Well, and you know, in a way they are. They need the adoration and attention and worship.
Right, that's valuable to them.
That's valuable to them, yeah. So right now as a society, we have it ass backwards where we'll fall for this shit all day. And even worse, if we see somebody else falling for it, we'll side with the narcissist because we can't tell the difference. And I'm talking about a general we here. And personally, I think I know I focus on narcissists, there's more than just narcissists that are problematic personality types.
No, sure, it makes for a great example, though.
The more we learn to understand, or the more population we get that can understand this stuff, I don't know what it is or what this number is, but at some point there's going to be a critical mass where I'm going to use the term sophist, where narcissist being a subcategory of sophist, where if there's a sophist picking on somebody else and there's a crowd watching, the crowd won't side with the sophist. They'll side with the guy getting picked on. Once that happens, we're in a different ball game completely.
Right.
But until that happens, good luck getting rid of government as a concept.
Right. Yeah. The Rothbard button does not seem like a good idea at all to me. And I get a lot of flack for it too from my friends. I'm sure that's not surprising. Everyone just wants to burn it down right away. And and that's not to say, like, you know, don't get me wrong.
And you don't. You're being very unreasonable.
Right,
apparently.
exactly right. And don't get me wrong. I am in just as much of a hurry to get inefficient systems replaced with efficient systems. Right? But you don't get that by blowing shit up.
Yeah, well, and then you don't get it until you can identify, like Nima was saying, the evildoers that will screw up any system that you give them. Okay,
so keeping in line with what we're talking about, but also kind of shifting back to economic, but not in the way that we were talking about economic. So when we talk about this and we talk about a stateless society and we talk about monetary systems and stuff like that, there are those on the left that think that when you remove state power, that gets replaced with capital power, economic power, right? That capitalism is going to let the powerful punish the poor, essentially.
Right, as if that doesn't happen currently. But yes, continue.
Well, it does. I mean, I think that a lot of now, bear with me because I'm making an argument from the left, which I am not.
Sure.
Right. But for the sake of conversation, I think their argument would be is that the state currently acts as a protector in a sense, however ineffective it may be at times from that kind of economic violence occurring. Mm-hmm. Remember, I did say ineffective, and that if you remove
no, and make the leftist argument. Go for it.
Right, and if you remove the state, then it would be even more egregious on the side of the economic punishments, right? And so the argument would be that if you remove the state, then all you kind of have is like a degradation into a feudal state.
Right, for whoever can grab the power the fastest.
Right. It's essentially, I believe the argument is that, you know, the economic power will just consolidate, and thus further driving the disparity of classes apart.
Okay.
Okay. I was just curious of your take on this, right? Because this is a big argument against anarcho-capitalism from the left.
Well, yeah, I think it's an attempt to get to anarcho-capitalism by just pushing a button, and so I can see how that probably won't end well either. If you look at right now, yeah, if you get rid of government, you're gonna have like super powerful technology corporations like Google, Amazon, with all the power, and they're basically quasi-government agencies in many cases. Google was basically created as part of the CIA venture capital program with In-Q-Tel, and Amazon gets government subsidies, etc. So it's almost not really, you can't really separate between public and private sector easily these days. So if you get rid of government, you still have all these powerful institutions who are then going to battle it out. And certainly going to have more power than the individual. So yeah, I mean, hard to say how that's going to end ever.
Do you think maybe that's why the economic Armageddon is embraced the way it is, as to almost provide the capitalist supporters who want to abolish the state as a way to kind of wipe the slate and start from zero?
Yeah, definitely.
I think the economic Armageddon is embraced because these people who embrace it, and I was one included, grew up in a situation where Armageddon was built into the system.
Sure.
Where you maybe had a family system or a specific parent or whatever, where it's just like, shit's going to blow up at any second.
Right. It's around the corner.
Shit's just going to blow up at any second, and I know it's coming, because it comes at some point. I mean, this is exactly what it was like for me. My mother was like a bomb with a fuse that I didn't know the length of, but I knew it was going to blow up. And I guess maybe in many cases, it's like, well, maybe if she blew up sooner, I would know what's coming and I could brace myself for it.
Right. It'd be nice if she didn't.
It'd be nice if she didn't at all, but it's
right.
built into the system. She's nuts.
Right.
So, I'm not saying that everybody who believes that, the Austrian system has that specific child raising growing up experience that I did, but I think there's something similar where, for whatever reason, a nihilistic flavor has been taken on, and they're just projecting that outward, and the Austrian explanation that the Armageddon is built into the system is a very handy way of getting there. Sure.
That makes sense. It does make sense. Do you see the place I was going though with that? Prior to that, aside from the nihilistic outlook of it, like strictly kind of on the battlefield of ideas. Right? Like, so you
say it again.
Sure, absolutely. So you have one side, this is the anarcho-capitalist side, and let's completely remove MMT from the discussion, right? And you're just talking about
Sure.
these kind of like purist libertarians that argue based on philosophy. And they're going to say, these are the guys that are, hit the Rothbard button, let it burn down, capitalism will thrive, everything will be great. And then you have the left that's going to come in and say, no, if you do that, then what's going to happen is it's going to degrade into a feudal state, and the people that are in places of economic power are going to consolidate that power, and it's going to create a further divergence of classes, and it's just going to be bad news. And the embrace from the Austrian side, what I was saying is, or the question I was posing is, does it, because it seems to make logical sense to me that if there is an economic collapse, right, everything starts back from zero. So it's almost in a sense of the economic collapse is almost a key component of the philosophy, because it leads to invalidate the concerns of the left. Because if you just nuke everything back to zero, then there's no power.
I guess I quasi agree with the left. Whereas I don't see Google and Amazon coming up as our overlords. I think there would just be smaller skirmishes where smaller political units would attempt to gain power within smaller areas, or maybe even invasions would occur. If we're just talking about the United States,
sure,
to gain territory and resources, and it would just go back to squabbling. I mean, this is kind of the argument that's often made for if we look at the Civil War and we support the North, because I mean, a conservative can look and say, hey, the South had every right to do what it did. But the North held everything together because one of the small things that isn't really emphasized in the Civil War was that the British supported the South. So we went to war with the British over in the War of Independence. They tried to attack us again in 1812 and even burnt down the Capitol. And then they support the South. Now, why would they support the South instead of the North? Well, if they wanted a weak political situation on the continent, well, one thing you could do is create two different political situations where that could, be played off against each other. So,
well, also as Carol Quigley wrote, it's always been a British strategy for centuries to support the weaker country on the European mainland, so to create a formidable opponent for all the other forces in that region, and then divide and conquer, basically.
So that is to say, the strategy would be to support the weaker opponent to be able to offer them support?
Yes.
Okay. Because they'd be more susceptible to taking it.
Yeah, and so I mean, imagine if the Confederacy had won the war, and there was two countries now. What the fuck could have happened in 150 years? How many more times would we have gone to war? How many other countries would have been made here?
Right.
And could the American idea have survived in all that chaos? Because, or I mean, let's even look at the British. Let's say the British were thinking that and said, okay, how do we get two countries here to weaken them? Let's say the South wins, they get their country. Well, could the North win, or could the British win against the North if the South was gone? I don't know, but I think it's definitely worth contemplating. And this idea that, okay, we'll just nuke it and go full libertarian states' rights and Capistan, and that everything will be great, nobody's going to invade us, and there's nobody on the inside that's going to try to turn into a warlord and create smaller political units. I think people are dreaming. And here's why I disagree with the leftists, is that it's not like, the companies are going to get big and powerful. No, some dude who doesn't mind killing people is going to march into the office, shoot the president of the company, and say, I just nationalized it.
Right. Yeah.
It's mine now.
Yeah, it's these are fun conversations to have. They really get down into the weeds of some of this stuff when you break apart the theory, because it's like you really start talking about division in the same camp. We're all talking about, this is essentially anarcho-capitalists who disagree with different versions of anarcho-capitalism. Right, I consider myself an ANCAP as well. I just don't. I like you were saying, Dylan. I favor the incremental approach. Only because I think there's more harm that will come from a Rothbard button than good.
Yeah. Well, and then to say what I said before in a different way, we are more fundamentally power politics creatures than we are rational creatures. In the most literal sense, we establish pecking orders before we barter over goods. And when a human being grows up and it goes through developmental phases, it's going to develop its pecking order phase before it's going to develop its, rational make sense of things phase. And if a human being never matures well enough to really get a hold of that rational phase, they see everything as pecking order phase. I'm either winning or losing.
Right.
There's no such thing as both of us winning at the same time. If you won, that means I lost. So, if you try to negotiate with them, they get angry. I mean, look at Antifa.
Right.
Like the act of trying to have a discussion with them pisses them off.
Yeah, it's pretty annoying.
Because the thinking is, if you can call whatever they're doing thinking, that this guy's trying to have a discussion, which means, you know, he's trying to get me to calm down, which means he's trying to stop me from winning. So he wants me to lose. Because the only thing is a win-lose interaction. Or even the people on the left who are like, oh, the classist warfare. You know, it's all set up as there's a winner and there's a loser. There's no such thing as both sides winning.
Right.
So we've got to mature out of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Otherwise, a Rothbard button is just going to create more caveman domination.
Right, more reactionary nonsense. More crazy bullshit. All right, fellas.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a good talk. I've enjoyed it quite a bit. Probably a good time to wrap it up. Before we do,
looks like everyone's getting tired.
No, I could go on forever. I love this shit, man. But you know, not everyone loves super long podcasts. But before we go, I know Dylan, you have a channel and you have stuff that you work on. Nima, you were talking about you have stuff that you work on. So I want to give you guys this moment to plug anything that you can point our listeners toward, that they can check your stuff out at alternate sources.
My YouTube channel is called the Volitional Science Network. And that's all I got right now. Volitional Science Network. Come check me out.
Yeah, hi, I'm Nima. You can find most of my stuff on economicsjunkie.com and on Twitter at economicsjunkie.
Okay, so you got the economics junkie stuff, and you said you had a website too.
Yeah, you mean the crypto related stuff?
Yeah, was it like Crypto Junkie?
Yeah, that's coinjabber.com. That's a crypto.
Coinjabber.
It's a Yelp for crypto, basically. Yeah, but
a Yelp for crypto?
Yeah.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a pretty neat concept. So you kind of like you know, like you can rate ICOs and stuff like that, or like people that have. What a clever idea!
And you can earn bitcoins for contributing content.
All right. Well, hey, hopefully you'll get some. Some people to check that out. I know I will. It sounds pretty interesting. Cool. All right. Well, hey, thanks a bunch for joining me, you guys. I really appreciate it. Thanks for killing your time here on my podcast. Is there anything else that you guys would like to say before we close out?
Don't balance the budget.
Austerity kills.
Theft.
Absolutely. All right. Well, listeners, thank you so much for listening. On behalf of everybody, we really appreciate you. And whether or not anybody likes it, we'll probably be back again.